Chapter 16 Son-in-Law and Father-in-Law. In the course of the earlier months of the year 1823, Napoleon had lived through many an anxious hour. He had finally realized that it was England who was stirring up Europe against him. Sheltered by her surrounding seas, slowly but surely she was weaving around him a net with living links, which were mended as fast as he broke them. A kind of holy war was in preparation all over Europe. With great difficulty, Napoleon had bled his empire once more. He had assembled 150,000 men, but quantity was no substitute for quality. Finally, a formidable question presented itself. What was Austria going to do? Napoleon could not bring himself to believe that his father-in-law would turn against him and act contrary to the interest of his own daughter and his grandson. Nevertheless, Napoleon needed Austria, and he must humor her. In this task, Marie-Louise would help him. Meanwhile, Napoleon felt that some military success might impress the Austrian emperor and empress and their ministers. On May 2nd, he crushed the Russians and the Prussians at Lutzen. Austria had been showing herself more and more lukewarm towards him. That would give her something to think about. On May 10th, Marie-Louise wrote to her father. Into her letter, she introduced this sentence: "I positively believe, quite between ourselves, that the Emperor will soon have 1,000,000 men under arms." But this threat failed to intimidate the Vienna government. On May 16th, Napoleon gave an audience to Count Bubna, whom the Austrian Emperor had sent to him to submit conditions on which peace might be concluded. With astonishment, Napoleon listened to a series of startling propositions. It was suggested that he should surrender the Illyrian provinces, Poland, Spain, the Confederation of the Rhine, part of Italy. Count Bubna, he broke out, "Is it proposed that I should purchase peace at the price of dishonor? Am I to sacrifice first my honor, then my wife and my son, and finally my dynasty?" These demands made him burn with indignation. Is my wife, the best of all wives, to be made a victim? Is France once more to be handed over to the Jacobins? Is this what you want? No, Count Bubna, I will not have France come to hate Austrian blood. But Napoleon understood. Austria had shown her hand. He must stop her from playing it. The only way was victory. On May 20th and 21st, at Botzen, he won a victory over the Russians and the Prussians, which he regarded as decisive. But all around him, bad omens were approaching. Clouds drifted across his star. His allies of yesterday, the Bavarians, the Württembergers, and the Saxons, deserted him one by one. In the south, Murat, and in the north, Bernadotte, were making ready to stab him in the back. Finally, he could feel the hostile breath of fate upon his face. At Lutzen, Marshal Bessières was killed. At Botzen, within a few yards of Napoleon, a bullet carried away Duroc. Duroc, his friend for 20 years, his most faithful comrade, the confidant of his troubles and his love affairs. It was too hard a blow. Napoleon broke down and wept. "Poor man," murmured the veteran grousers of the guard, as they looked at him. "He has lost one of his children." Austria cleverly took advantage of this moment to offer her official mediation. Napoleon accepted it, and on June 4th he signed the armistice of Pleaswitz. Quite naturally, it was Metternich who was entrusted with presenting to the Emperor of the French the conditions on which the Allies were ready to retreat. Napoleon received him at the Marcolini Palace in Dresden on June 26th. The audience began at noon. As he made his way to the gallery where the Emperor was to receive him, the Austrian Chancellor saw all around him courtiers and gold-bedecked generals with anxious faces. Berthier approached him and whispered in his ear, "Don't forget that Europe needs peace, and France above all. All she wants is peace." Metternich felt a wild joy rising within his breast. At last, the diplomat's word was about to break the invincible Caesar's sword. Napoleon came forward to meet him, with his sword at his side, and his cockaded beaver hat under his arm. "So here you are, Monsieur von Metternich," he said. "I am glad to see you, but if you want peace, why do you come so late?" The Chancellor bowed his long head deferentially. "To give peace to the world, sire," he murmured, "depends only on you." "You think so? In any case, your master does not make my task any the easier. I win 2 victories, and my weakened enemies are on the point of treating for peace. All at once, you come in between us. You talk to me about armistice and mediation, and you talk to them about alliance. Everything is in a muddle again. But for you, peace would have been made already. Come now, confess that Austria is no longer on my side. She is my enemy. But now you have 200,000 men ready under Schwarzenberg. You think you are in a position to dictate terms to me, do you? Not at all, sire. You are strangely mistaken about our intentions." But Napoleon's nerves were on edge. He paced quickly up and down the gallery, dragging the Chancellor with him. "Listen to me, Metternich. I am ready to make peace, but I will die sooner than sign a dishonorable peace. As I wrote to the Emperor, my honor above all, and then peace. Your sovereigns, who are born to their thrones, can let themselves be defeated a score of times, and still return to their capitals. I cannot do that, because I am a soldier who has risen to the throne. My rule would not survive for a moment if I ceased to be strong, and therefore to be feared." The Chancellor never said a word. He kept his eyes half closed, withdrawn into himself, but ready to make a spring. The emperor came to a standstill. He tried to look Metternich straight in the eyes, but the chancellor avoided his look. Then, in a confidential tone, Napoleon went on, "I can guess your game, Metternich. Your government is seeking to take advantage of my difficulties, and even add to them as much as it can, in order to recover part of what it has lost. A question presents itself for you. Can you hold me to ransom without fighting, or must you draw the sword and line up with my enemies? Very well, let's talk business." Metternich promptly launched forth into high diplomatic considerations. He talked about respect for rights. He talked about a peace guaranteed by a league of independent states. He lost himself in the clouds. His slyness exasperated Napoleon. "Can't you speak more plainly?" he cried. "Don't forget that I am a soldier, better at breaking than bending. I offer you Illyria in exchange for your neutrality. Does that suit you? My army is quite strong enough to bring the Russians and the Prussians to reason. I simply ask for your neutrality." "Ah, sire," replied Metternich, "things have reached such a point that we can no longer remain neutral. We must be either for you or against you." His tone was both honeyed and hinting. Napoleon understood that he was being invited to make a bargain. He led the chancellor into the map room. "What do you want?" he asked. Metternich's hand clutched at the map of Europe, like a claw, as it moved about on the map. Napoleon felt that every movement it made was tearing away a piece of his own flesh. He gasped, as though a noose were suddenly knotted round his neck. "What?" he cried. "Not only Illyria, but also half Italy, Holland, Spain, Poland, the Confederation of the Rhine. In short, you want everything." His lip curled. "So such is your spirit of moderation. In fact, peace is a mere pretext. What you are all aiming at is the dismemberment of the French Empire. With a stroke of the pen, you would knock down the ramparts of Danzig, Magdeburg, Antwerp, Mantua, a score of other fortresses, whose keys I obtained only as the reward of victory." Napoleon dragged Metternich back into the gallery. He marched up and down like a madman, kneading his hat in his hands. "And it is when the French flag still floats at the mouth of the Vistula. It is when my victorious armies are at the gates of Berlin and Breslau. It is when I am here in person at the head of 300,000 men. It is as such a time that Austria flatters herself that without even drawing the sword, she can make me sign such terms. Without even drawing the sword. This piece of presumption is an outrage." He flung his hat on the floor and trampled on it. In a rage, he was white in the face. His eyes were wild. His breath came short. Impassive, with a slight smile at the corner of his mouth, Metternich waited for the storm to blow over. "And it is my father-in-law," Napoleon went on, "who lends himself to such a proposal. It is he who sends you here, but he is widely mistaken if he thinks that a mutilated throne would serve as any shelter for his daughter and his grandson in France. Napoleon swung round. He advanced upon the Chancellor. Metternich recoiled. Napoleon seized him by the collar. He stared into his eyes. "Aha, Metternich, how much did England pay you to get you to play this part against me?" Metternich's face went ashen. He staggered as though he had been hit. A murky gleam flashed from his eyes. It was quickly veiled by his heavy lids. Napoleon bit his lip. He realized that he had gone too far. He had lit a flame of hatred in his visitor's heart, which only death could quench. The two of them resumed their discussion. Hours went by, but the opponents went on taking one another's measure. It was a fight between a tiger, roaring and clawing at a void, and a snake, shifty, unseizable, who dodged out of the way and tirelessly writhed his murderous coils forward again. "If you go to war again, sire," Metternich said, softly, "fortune may desert France. You have only an army of boys." Napoleon jumped at the insult. His reply rang like a box on impertinent ears. "You are no soldier. You do not know what takes place in a soldier's soul. I grew up on the battlefield, and a man like me thinks little of the lives of 1,000,000 men. For that matter, of those who died in Russia, only 30,000 were French. The rest were all Poles and Germans." "You forget that you are talking to a German," remarked Metternich. Napoleon stopped short. He knew that he had made a slip. Metternich drove home his advantage. "Why say such a thing to me, within 4 walls?" he asked insolently. "Open the doors. Let your words ring out from one end of France to the other. It is not the cause I represent which will be the loser." The Emperor said nothing for some little time. He picked up his hat. A year or two earlier, Metternich would have presented it to him on bended knee. Then Napoleon said, "So I did a very foolish thing when I married an Austrian archduchess." Metternich's reply was deliberate. "Since your Majesty asks me my opinion, I shall say frankly that Napoleon the Conqueror is doing such a thing now. Then the Emperor Francis wants to dethrone his daughter." Metternich felt that he had his adversary at his mercy. "The Emperor," he answered, "is before all else a sovereign. The interest of his peoples will always come first in his decisions." Napoleon shrugged his shoulders. His anger flared up again. "In short, I made an irreparable mistake when I married the Archduchess. I hoped to merge the past with the present. I was wrong. I see now how far wrong I was. My throne may collapse, but I will bury the world under its ruins." It was the last spurt of his wrath. Night was falling. It was nearly 8 o'clock. Napoleon felt tired. For a few moments he sought comfort in the thought of his son. It was for the little king that he was fighting. He recalled that fair head, which had been the cornerstone of a fine future. Now that future was falling to pieces in all directions. He stared at Metternich again. This was the man whom he had overwhelmed with honors. This was the man whom he had trusted. This was the courtier who had drunk the King of Rome's health before he was born. What bitter irony! Yet despite everything, he felt a kind of respect for Metternich. He remembered Talleyrand, who was betraying him. Why had he not such a faithful servant as Metternich? He must make one more effort. Where threats had failed, flattery might succeed. He owed so much to his personal power of attraction. He forced himself to be friendly, coaxing. "Well," he said, as he showed Metternich out in person, "we shall meet again, I hope." He laid his hand on Metternich's shoulder. His tone was one of good fellowship. "Do you know what I think? You're not going to make war on me." They reached the door, and darkness swallowed them up. Metternich turned slowly towards the Emperor. His eyes gleamed with all the iciness of his stubborn soul. He did not lower them as he murmured, "You are lost, sire." Chapter 17. Innocent Victims. Napoleon saw an abyss yawning at his feet. Perhaps he felt that it was fated to swallow him up. If he was to die, he wanted first to see the woman he loved. If this was to be his last fight, he craved to steep his soul in affection once more. He missed Marie-Louise. He longed to hold her to his heart again. He asked her to come and join him on July 24th at Mainz. Ever since he left Paris, scarcely a day had passed without his writing to her. He treated his wife more or less like a child. He went out of his way to hide the truth from her, all the more since it assumed the form of definite, approaching disaster. At the gravest moments, he took it upon himself to deceive her, to feign confidence and cheerfulness, to try and entertain her. On the morrow of his interview with Metternich, he wrote to her, "What you tell me about the little king's jealousy made me laugh. I wish I could see him. Give him 3 kisses for me. Have you seen the elephant in the zoological gardens?" The Empress left the King of Rome behind her at St. Cloud. She was fond of him, to be sure, but her concern with him scarcely went beyond getting Isabey and Gerard to paint portraits of him. So she set off with an easy mind, trusting entirely in Madame de Montesquieu. Indeed, in everything the little king's governess did, she deserved the confidence which the emperor had placed in her. Not only did she look after the boy's health, she also concerned herself with his education, and sought to develop his mind. The boy was tall and strong for his age, but his intelligence was backward, so Madame de Montesquieu gave him as a playmate little Albert, the son of Madame Froment, one of the Red Women. He was a year older than the King of Rome. and he had no idea of the respect due to his majesty. The two boys played, quarreled, and sometimes fought together. One day Albert wanted a wheelbarrow, and the king refused to give it up. "You're not going to have it," he said. Albert persisted and tried to pull the wheelbarrow away. When the little king held on to it, Albert hit him. The little king looked at him. He was quite conscious of the sacrilege which his playmate had committed. "Supposing somebody had seen you," he exclaimed. "But you needn't worry, I won't tell anybody." Thanks to this comradeship, the prince made progress. He talked more fluently, and Madame de Montesquieu started teaching him his alphabet. He was full of life and energy, and so restless that nets had to be put round his bed and his close stool to catch him when he wriggled off them. Now that he was old enough to understand, his governess lost no opportunity of taking him in hand and teaching him how to behave. One day, in a fit of temper, he rolled on the floor, screaming at the top of his voice. Without saying a word, Madame de Montesquieu closed the shutters and the windows. Surprised to find himself suddenly in the dark, the prince stopped screaming. "Monsieur," he asked, "why have you shut the windows?" "For fear anybody should hear you," replied his governess. "Do you think the French people would ever want you for their prince if they knew you got into a temper like that?" The boy was dumbfounded. He thought that over. "Do you think anybody heard me?" he said. "I hope nobody did. I'm sorry, Monsieur, I won't do it again." Another time, when he was out for a walk, the King of Rome caught sight of two scapegraces of his own age, playing in the gutter. They were ragged and dirty, but they seemed to be having a very good time. The prince was so keenly interested in their gambols in the mire that he had to be dragged away almost by force. He said nothing for the moment, but an hour later at the chateau, Madame de Montesquieu felt a little hand pulling at her skirt, and a little voice, the voice of a boy clad in silk and velvet, begged humbly, "Monsieur, if I'm very good, will you let me go and roll in the mud?" Chapter 18. Defeat. On August 2nd, Marie-Louise left Napoleon at Mans and returned to St. Cloud by way of Cologne, Aix-la-Chapelle, Liege, and Compiègne. She had to make haste, for Napoleon had decided that at the end of the month she should go to Cherbourg to open the new docks there. For his part, he set off to rejoin his army. The hour was decisive. By now Napoleon knew where he stood. The Congress of Prague had arrived at no conclusion, and Austria had openly lined up with Prussia and Russia. But Napoleon's fortunes had sunk so low that one enemy more to fight scarcely mattered. For his birthday, on August 15th, he received some verses sent him by his son, for what purported to be the work of a poet of 29 months. They had a pretty turn of phrase. Caresses once were all my dower. To tell my thoughts to you, I offer you the tribute of a flower, as simple as the love one feels it too. 100 kisses now I must repay, and I myself would haste to give you these, if I could follow in my Father's way, as fast as he pursues his enemies. Napoleon smiled with a bitter twist at the corners of his mouth. How much longer would he be able to pursue his enemies, in accordance with the hopes expressed by the author of the poem? Meanwhile he made ready to sell his life dearly. On August 27th, at Dresden, with 110,000 men, he crushed 200,000 Russians, Prussians, and Austrians. On August 29th, he wrote to Marie-Louise, "My dear, I have had a fine battle. I have given Prince Schwarzenberg and the Emperor Alexander a good hiding. Papa Francis's troops have never been so bad. They are badly clothed, half naked. I took 25,000 prisoners, 30 colors, and a number of cannon. I am going to send you all these." The next day he added, "Give the little king 2 kisses from me. I am told that he is now talking like an orator. How I wish I could hear him. The Russians have burned 10 small towns and villages in Bohemia. That won't please Papa Francis." Then came Leipzig, that battle of nations. It lasted for 3 days, from the 16th to the 18th of October. Napoleon thought he had victory in his grasp, but it escaped him. His allies, the Saxons, deserted him on the field of battle. It was his turn to experience defeat. He lost 50,000 men. He proceeded to beat a retreat in all haste with the remnant of his army. A fresh enemy fell upon them, typhus. Napoleon was in flight, but he could still strike back terribly against human opponents. On October 30th, at Hanau, he brushed aside the Bavarians and the Austrians when they tried to cut off his retreat. He sent Marie-Louise the score of colors which he had captured in earlier battles. They would serve to diminish the effect of the disaster in Paris. On November 2nd, he crossed the Rhine. A week later at night, he arrived at St. Cloud, where the court, without news of him for a month, was a prey to the worst anxiety. He embraced Marie-Louise and looked around for his son. Where was the little king? He was being put to bed. "I'll go and see him," said the emperor. He made his way to the boy's apartments, clad in a long white nightshirt. The boy was on his knees at a faldstool, with his hands clasped and his golden curls gleaming softly in the light of the wax candles. He was saying his prayers, obediently repeating the words whispered to him by Madame Montesquieu. Standing beside him, "Dear God, let Papa grant us peace, for the happiness of France." Napoleon swept back the lock that curled down his forehead. He held on to the door jamb. He dare not go in now. Peace. Did peace depend on him any more? Chapter 19. Shadow and Light. Napoleon had lunched alone, just as he used to, at his little mahogany table. He waved away the head waiter and the prefect of the palace, who, standing beside him with his hat under his arm, had attended him at his meal. He wanted to be alone. He put his elbow on the table, laid his broad brow on his delicate hand, and reflected. This time it was France herself that he must defend. But with what? Where was he to find troops? He had squeezed the country to its last drop of blood, its last cent. The best blood of its youth had been drunk up by the plains of Italy, Germany, and Russia. There was nothing left for the soil of France but dregs. Ah, Napoleon sighed, if only I had those gallant fellows I lost in Russia. It was not only they he lacked, they were also the 170,000 men whom he had left behind in the fortresses of Germany. They would soon have to surrender. To be sure, on November 8th, at Frankfurt, the Allies had made a peace proposal to him, but it was on such terms that he had been bound to reject it. Now, in the eyes of the world, it was he who seemed bent on war. War, whichever way he turned. His own dreaded face encountered not the glorious face of triumph which had so often smiled upon him, but a face which wore the hideous mask of defeat. The enemy, squatting on the other side of the Rhine like some monstrous devil-fish, had launched 3 gigantic tentacles against France on New Year's Day, 1814. Napoleon shrugged his shoulders. How easy his task would be if he had to fight only against the enemy outside. But now opponents, perhaps even more formidable, were multiplying inside the country. The morale of the people was low, and discontent was general. In the South and West, young conscripts were deserting and taking refuge in the mountains and the forest. The middle classes, hard hit by the economic crisis and the slump in stocks, were grumbling. The Legislative Assembly, on whom the Emperor had leaned for help, had failed him, thus paying off its old scores. Treason gnawed at the very heart of the country. The highest post in the empire bred cankers. Talleyrand was maintaining relations with the Emperor of Russia and the Austrian Emperor, and making ready to sell himself to the highest bidder. The nobility, to whom Napoleon had restored their estates and their fortunes, openly longed for the return of the Bourbons. Napoleon looked around him. He found himself alone and ill, worn and aged. He had lost his best comrades, Lannes, Beziers, Duroc. The rest thought only about peace, even after Leipzig, when he contemplated marching on Berlin. Some of his marshals had cried, "Haven't enough of us been killed? Are we all to leave our bones abroad?" But it should not be. Sooner death than surrender without a struggle. And what about his son? Was he to bequeath only ruin and dishonor to the little king of Rome? His great dream had collapsed, but with its remnants he would bestir himself to reconstruct a throne for his son. Quick, let cannon, muskets, cartridges be manufactured. Let the fortresses be put in repair. Let hospitals be established. The enemy were at hand. Ah, if only he had a month longer. but he must hasten to help MacDonald, Marmont, and Victor, who had had to abandon the Rhine and fall back on Champagne. Let his men be equipped. How many were there? 50,000, and the enemy numbered over 400,000. Napoleon laughed. 50,000 men and myself. That makes 150,000. Napoleon dragged Marie-Louise with him all over Paris. He wanted to show himself everywhere at once, at the theater, in the workshops, on parade, in the factories, in the barracks, to all who shirked, to all who hesitated, to all who doubted. He wanted to say, "See, here I am. I will defend you. I will save you. Trust me." Often he took the little king with him, clad as a colonel of the Polish lancers, or as an officer of the horse grenadiers. With outstretched arms he showed the boy, all gold lace and plumes, to the crowd. They cheered despite themselves. It was not for himself that Napoleon called upon their aid, asked fresh sacrifices from them. It was for his son. The only hours of respite Napoleon knew were those which his son gave him. It was in the company of this boy of 3 that he found new strength to go on struggling, to overcome the feeling of nausea which rose in his throat like sour froth in the presence of the cowardice of those who owed him everything. How he spoiled the boy! He gave him wooden horses, 10 sets of doll's furniture, a doll dressed as a Chinaman, a miniature billiard table, a game of goose, and dozens of other toys. He got a Mameluke's uniform made for him, with a crimson velvet cap crowned with an egret, a pelisse of green velvet, and breeches of Louviers cloth, the whole embroidered, spangled, and done to perfection. He paraded the little king, thus arrayed and booted like the cat in the fairy tale, all over the Tuileries palace. Some of the King of Rome's doings delighted the emperor. The boy was kind-hearted. One day, from a window, he caught sight of a little boy in the street, in mourning, holding on to his mother with one hand and waving a roll of paper in the other. "Why is that little boy dressed in black?" he asked. "Probably because his father is dead," replied Madame de Montesquieu. "And what is he doing with that paper?" "Perhaps it's a petition he wants to present to you." "Then I'd like to see him," said the King of Rome. The young petitioner was sent forth. He explained that his father had been killed during the last campaign, and that as a result his mother and himself were reduced to poverty. A pension would be welcome. "I'll tell Papa," said the prince. The next day, indeed, he said to his father, "Papa, here's a petition from a little boy whose father died because of you. Give him a pension." Napoleon smiled. That "because of you" was not lacking a piquancy. He lifted his son up and kissed him. "You are a good boy," he said. "I'll issue an order for a pension this very day." By this time the little prince was able to trot all over the palace. One day he ran ahead of his governess to the door of the emperor's study. It was guarded by a footman in a green coat and black breeches. "Let me in," said the boy. "I want to see Papa." "No, sire, I cannot let you in," replied the footman, whose orders were strict. The boy stamped his foot. "Why not? I am the little king." "But your Majesty is all alone. The Emperor had given orders that his son was not to be admitted unless he was accompanied by Madame de Montesquieu." Finally the governess made her appearance. Strengthened by this reinforcement, the prince cried proudly, "Open the door. It is the will of the little king." The footman opened the door of the study, and announced, in a ringing tone, "His Majesty the King of Rome." His Majesty, head held high, strode in like a grown-up. A ministerial council was just coming to an end, with no eyes for anybody but his father. The boy ran towards him with outstretched arms. The Emperor took him in his arms, turned him around, and said severely, "You have not greeted these gentlemen, sire. Come on, greet them." The boy turned to the ministers and bowed to them. Then he raised his hands to his lips and blew kisses to all of them. Napoleon sat down again, with his son in his arms. "Well, gentlemen," he said with a laugh, "I hope that nobody can say that I have neglected my son's education. As you see, he can be both ceremonious and childishly sincere." Chapter 20. The Last Kiss. It was January 23rd, 1814, a Sunday. It was cold. Bad news swept Paris in pestilential waves. To the north and east the enemy were advancing. The people were fleeing before the Cossacks and the Uhlans, who were laying the countryside waste, burning villages and raping women. Napoleon felt that the wind of panic was freezing the people of Paris to the heart. He had waited until the very last moment. Now he must set off to fight the invaders and drive them back. But in his absence, who would defend his capital and his wife and his son, whom he must leave behind him? After thinking things over thoroughly, he had found the right way, and he had arranged the setting which was essential for the accomplishment of his plan. After Mass, he left the chapel with Marie-Louise, and made his way to the Hall of the Marshals, where 600 officers of the National Guard were assembled. As soon as he entered the room, a door on the opposite side opened, and Madame de Montesquieu came in, carrying the King of Rome. As a delicate compliment, the prince was clad in the uniform of an officer of the National Guard, with a beaver hat adorned with a silver cockade and white plumes. On his breast he wore the Grand Cross of the Legion of Honor in diamonds. Napoleon and Marie-Louise each took hold of one of the boy's hands and went forward into the midst of the officers, who gathered round them. "I am setting off," said Napoleon, in a loud voice, "to put myself at the head of the army and give battle to our enemies. You know the dangers which threaten our country, but our courage can face them and overcome them." In striking terms he depicted the barbarian hordes who were defiling the soil of France, the sufferings of the peasant population. He called upon the whole nation to forget its discords and take up arms in defense of freedom. Then his voice trembled and broke under stress of the emotion which he could not conceal. "I am your chosen leader. You have made me what I am. It is your duty to defend me." He pushed Marie Louise and the King of Rome in front of him. "I leave in your guard what is dearest to me. After France, my wife, and my son, I entrust them to you. I entrust them to the affection of my faithful city of Paris. You will answer to me for them, will you not? You will defend them." Napoleon stopped, flung his arms out and his head back, and gazed at the 600 men who were hanging on his words, as though he would search their very souls. "You will defend them, will you not?" he repeated. "You will defend them." It was as though an electric current had run through the crowd of officers. A shout rolled through the hall like a thunderclap. "Long live the Emperor!" A forest of arms went up in the air. "We swear it! We swear it!" Marie Louise reeled with emotion. Napoleon caught her in his arms. Then he handed her over to her women, took the little king in his arms, and passed in front of his officers, who cheered him. He went out into the place du Carrousel, where the battalions of the National Guard were massed. They shouted with enthusiasm. Napoleon walked down their ranks, showing them the boy, raising him in the air, and stopping to kiss him every few yards. Napoleon was radiant with delight, once more in the cheers that burst out in his presence. He cooled the heart of Paris. He was intoxicated with happiness, pride, and confidence. And now he said to himself, "I am sure of it. I shall win." The next day, the last day, had come. Napoleon gave his final instructions to his brother, to Champagne, the secretary to the Regency, and to Nezelof, his own secretary, whom he had put at Marie Louise's disposal. "Keep up the Empress's spirits, spare her anxiety. If there is bad news, break it to her gently." All the afternoon of January 24th, Napoleon spent shut up in his study with the King of Rome. For these few hours he wanted to have his son all to himself. The boy never left his arms. For the last time, Napoleon studied a maneuver on the carpet with his mahogany pieces. Here was Blücher, there was Schwarzenberg, in the center, Sawkins and York's Army Corps. Holding his chin in his hands, Napoleon reflected. Should he outflank the enemy on the left or on the right, or should he break through their center? Suddenly the boy thrust out his hand and moved some of the pieces. Then he pulled his hand back and looked at his father anxiously. Was he going to get a scolding? But the Emperor embraced him. "Hurrah!" he cried. "Victory at last! That's the way to win it. So you're giving me lessons, are you, you young rascal?" He played with the boy, rolling him on the floor. He told him stories. He jumped him up and down on his knees. "Come on," he said. "Let's fight Papa Francis." The boy clapped his hands, laughing till the tears came into his eyes. At length it was the King of Rome's bedtime. Napoleon dined with Marie Louise and Hortense. Then he took them into his study. The two women sat down on either side of the fireplace, in which a big fire was blazing. Napoleon walked about the room, opening drawers, sorting papers, tearing some up and throwing the pieces into the fire. As the flames leaped up, they illuminated the depressed faces of Marie-Louise and Hortense, sitting silently with their hands in their laps. As he passed them, Napoleon kissed his wife and patted Hortense on the cheek. "Come, come," he exclaimed. "Don't be so sad. Trust me. Don't I know my job any more?" "Of course," they replied. The hours went by. Midnight, 2 o'clock. Several times a footman brought new candles and flung fresh fuel on the fire. Finally, the hour of separation came. "You're going to be tired out again," murmured Marie-Louise. "I shall sleep in the carriage as usual. I shall be at Chalons by this evening." Napoleon took his wife in his arms and kissed her passionately. He tried to make a joke. "Don't cry. I'm only going to beat Papa Francis again." Marie-Louise clung to him. Her eyes, as she raised them to him, were heavy with tears and anxiety. "You'll come back soon." Napoleon did not answer. Some force within him seemed to forbid him to flaunt fate. At length, after a long silence, he said, in a grave tone of voice, "That, mio ben, is God's secret." He handed the fainting empress over to Madame de Montebello, and made his way to the King of Rome's apartments. His last visit was to his son. He went into the boy's bedroom, where a nightlight was burning. The little king lay in his cot. At the feet, the bronze eagle stood erect, and its eyes fixed on Napoleon's star, whose rays seemed to bless and protect the boy. He was fast asleep, with his fair curls tumbling on the pillow, and making a luminous halo around his head. Long, lovingly, Napoleon gazed at that dear face. Beneath his closed eyes, the boy's long lashes cast shadows on his round, rosy cheeks. The nostrils of his little tip-tilted nose quivered. In between his lips, creased by a dimple, gleamed a flash of his tiny teeth. Beneath his chin, his open nightshirt disclosed his throat, soft as silk, with life throbbing in it. Outside, the sheets lay in a plump arm, and at the end of it, a little hand was like a flower with 5 delicate petals. The emperor could not tear himself away from gazing at the human being he loved best in the world. "My son," he murmured, "my little son." From the sight of him, Napoleon drew a supreme comfort. The picture of his son, which he carried away with him, would surely save him from disaster or death. But he must be going. The yellow brougham, which had carried him to the 4 corners of Europe, had been waiting outside the palace for hours. The horses would be pawing the ground, and Bertrand, the Grand Marshal, would be getting impatient. Napoleon bent over the cot. Softly he laid his lips on his son's brow, just below his hair. Disturbed, the boy turned over. Then sleep flowed over him again, like a pure stream, barely murmuring. The emperor straightened himself. He made his way to the door. On the threshold, he turned back for a last look at that fair, innocent, sleeping head, for which so many men were to die. It was over. Napoleon plunged into the night. Behind him, an invisible hand drew a curtain of fire which was to separate living souls forever. He was never to see his wife or his son again.